Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, welcome to this conference in Davos, which picks up on a theme that has become an ever greater preoccupation not only for the international community but also for the United Nations family as a whole. Disaster risk reduction, understanding the changing scale, pattern, frequency and nature of disasters is indeed a preoccupation that is no longer the privilege of scientists or a risk management community alone. It has become a responsibility for leaders and institutions across the spectrum of our society. Thus, the theme of public-private partnerships is also a very appropriate one, because the only way forward for us to cope with the changing nature of disasters is indeed to mobilize efforts across all sectors and actors in society. Climate change has become perhaps the most stark illustration of the changing nature of the challenges that we face as societies and as economies. Global warming has opened our eyes to the fact that the scale and nature of disaster and risk management are changing so rapidly that neither our institutions nor our technologies nor indeed our management systems seem to be ready to cope with these changes. Clearly, from the perspective of the United Nations Environment Programme, we are very actively involved in many of the efforts around disaster risk reduction. Indeed, in the United Nations family, not only in the context of the Hyogo framework, but also the ISDR work and indeed the new partnership platform on environment and disaster risk reduction, which is being coordinated by UNEP. We are intensifying our efforts and also engaging more actively with many partners to work in a family of institutions and knowledge partners to address these issues. Clearly, from an environmental perspective, what is important is that we must understand how disasters, on the one hand, will become more frequent, greater in scale, and also more potent in terms of their destructive potential because of the actions that we are undertaking as peoples, as economies, as industries, and their impacts on the environment. Natural disasters, in one sense, cannot be prevented. An earthquake is not something we can manage, but indeed we can recognize the risks and we can reduce the risks. But these are not the only disasters we are facing. Indeed, the images of flooding, of people being airlifted or very often not being in a position to be helped in situations of floods or droughts are part of an ever-growing disaster scenario that with climate change will exacerbate further. The impacts on our infrastructure, on vulnerable communities, on coastal zones and coastal settlements are of such a scale and indeed potential risk that our ability to manage these risks and the consequences that arise from these disasters is truly a challenge we now face. Environmental management is part of a disaster risk reduction strategy. This is more true than ever when we look at climate change and particularly the notion of adaptation. As we become more vulnerable, as global warming affects the resilience and indeed affects the vulnerability of many communities in our economies across the world, understanding the link between disaster risk reduction and enhancing the resilience of our ecosystems becomes ever more important. It is one reason why in UNEP's new medium-term strategy, not only have we created as one of the 6 focal themes and sub-program areas, conflicts and disasters as one of the focal areas in which UNEP wishes to contribute over the coming years to the international efforts to address these issues, but also our ecosystem program and our focus on trying to understand how we can enhance the functionality and also the resilience of ecosystems to help societies cope with the inevitable escalation of weather-related or indeed other disaster-prone areas in the world. Our objective is to try and reinforce the capacity of nations and societies, but also communities at the local level, to anticipate disasters, to conduct risk assessments that will enable them to prepare better for what may be inevitable, but also to allow us at the international level, particularly in the context of the climate change negotiations, to act now, to try and act in a way that will reduce the prospect and the scale of the disasters we will face in the future. Because without these actions and without an international approach to addressing the challenges that we also identified in the Global Environment Outlook published last year by UNEP, which go well beyond the climate change dimension and indeed point also towards many of the other potential areas of environmental degradation that are increasing the potential for disasters. All of these taken together must form part of an international effort to, one, understand better the risks we will face, the nature of these risks, but also what we can do to enhance our ability to cope with them and ultimately reduce their destructive impact on people, on communities and economies. I hope that in Davos, as you meet and review both the experiences we have gathered, but also the challenges we face in terms of moving forward at the national but also the international level, you will provide both inspiration and guidance to us, to the international community, and indeed to all the partners that we have to bring to the table to address these issues. I wish you a very successful conference.